My husband, Michael, was a man who lived his life in the spotlight, always ready with a smile or a grand gesture. Ethan, my son, slammed his glass onto the table. "Dad spent his entire life cleaning up your messes," he snapped. "And even 12 years after he passed, you're still playing the victim." The room went completely silent. No one stood up for me. No one challenged him. They looked at me as if I were exactly the person he described. For 12 long years, I had guarded a secret for a man who was no longer here to defend himself, bearing the weight of accusations for choices I never made. That night, looking around the table, I finally reached a breaking point. "All right," I said, my voice steady. "If you want the truth, then you're going to hear the whole truth. If you've ever felt misunderstood by the people you love most, I want to hear your story." Before we continue, if this story resonates with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments. If your own child said something like this to you, how would you handle it? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment. I wasn't always the person my son painted me to be. Once upon a time, I was just Gwen Sullivan. I was a young woman with a used car, living in a small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, with big dreams for the future. And back then, Michael Sullivan was the center of every one of those dreams. I met Michael when I was 24. I still remember the first day I saw him. I was working the front desk at a small accounting firm, and he walked in carrying a box of files with the most confident smile I'd ever seen. Everyone loved Michael. Within 10 minutes, he knew everyone's name. Within an hour, he had the whole office laughing. Less than a week later, he asked me out. Looking back, I understand why it was so easy for people to trust him. Michael had a gift. He knew exactly how to make you feel like the only person in the room. When he looked at you, you felt like what you said mattered. And when he loved you, it felt like sunlight. At least, in the beginning. 2 years later, we were married. Those early years were truly happy. We bought a small fixer-upper house with peeling paint and weeds in the yard. We didn't have much money, but we had dreams. We spent weekends working on the place, and since we couldn't afford furniture, we'd sit on the living room floor eating takeout, laughing the night away. Most importantly, we wanted a family. When Ethan was born, Michael cried harder than I did. I can still see him standing by my hospital bed, holding our tiny son. "I'm going to give him everything I never had," he whispered. For years, I truly believed he would. Michael was an incredible father to Ethan. He coached Little League, showed up to every school event, and helped with science projects. To the outside world, he was the perfect father, the perfect husband, the perfect man. That image was so deeply ingrained that even after he passed, no one questioned his character, not even our son. For a long time, I didn't either, at least not publicly. The first signs that things weren't right were so small, I almost missed them. It was about 8 years into our marriage, and I was balancing our checkbook. We were always on a tight budget, so I tracked every dollar, every bill, every receipt. I found a withdrawal I couldn't explain. $300. It wasn't enough to cause a panic, but it was enough to make me curious. When Michael got home, I asked him about it. "Oh, that?" he said, acting like it was nothing. "I lent some money to a coworker." I accepted that explanation immediately. That's what trust was back then. A few months later, it happened again. This time it was $500. Again, he had an excuse. A friend in need, car repairs, an emergency, a temporary setback. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband. The man who kissed me goodbye every morning. The man who tucked our son in every night. The man everyone admired. But over the next few years, the missing money became harder and harder to explain. Small amounts turned into large ones. Unexpected withdrawals became frequent. Our credit card balances began to climb. Sometimes I pushed for answers. Sometimes Michael would get defensive. Not angry, just impatient, as if my concern was unreasonable. "I'll take care of it, Gwen," became his favorite mantra. "I'll take care of it." At first, I wanted to believe him. Later, I had to believe him because the alternative was too terrifying. The alternative meant something was happening in our marriage that I couldn't grasp. One night after Ethan was asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at a pile of unpaid bills. The numbers just didn't add up. No matter how many times I checked, we were making enough money to live comfortably, yet we were constantly struggling. Michael walked into the kitchen with a beer. He saw the documents spread out on the table, and his smile vanished. "What now?" he asked. I remember that line because it hurt. Not because he yelled, but because he sounded exhausted by my questions, as if I were the one causing the trouble. I showed him the bills, the balances, the growing debt. For a long while he said nothing. Then he sat down and rubbed his forehead. It was the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. Not impatience, fear. "I've made some mistakes," he admitted. My heart sank. Mistakes sounded much worse than unpaid bills. "What kind of mistakes?" I asked calmly. Michael looked away. The silence that followed felt endless. Even now, decades later, I can still hear the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking above the stove, and the sound of my own heart racing. Finally, he looked at me. "They're just temporary setbacks," he said. "I can fix them." But he didn't answer my question. Not really. In that moment, something shifted inside me. For the first time in our marriage, I realized there were parts of Michael's life I couldn't see, parts he didn't want me to see. The discovery frightened me, but it also awakened something else, a quiet, growing suspicion. Over the next few months, I became more observant. I started noticing details, phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room, missing receipts, late nights he couldn't fully explain. Whenever I pushed for answers, Michael became better at changing the subject. Sometimes he apologized, sometimes he promised things would get better, and sometimes he'd hold my hand and tell me I was overthinking things. Worst of all, I wanted to believe him, because believing him was so much easier than facing the truth. Meanwhile, Ethan was growing into a wonderful young man. He did well in school, loved baseball, and idolized his father. Whenever I saw them together, I convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than raising difficult questions. Maybe that was my biggest mistake. Not because I didn't trust Michael, not because I didn't love him, but because I chose silence when I should have demanded honesty. Years later, that silence cost me more than I could have imagined. It ruined my reputation, it fractured my relationship with my son, and it nearly destroyed my relationship with my entire family. But at the time, I had no idea. I only knew that the man I loved was hiding something serious, something dangerous. And despite all his promises, the problems weren't getting smaller. They were getting much, much bigger. One rainy afternoon, while I was organizing papers Michael had left on his desk, I found an envelope he'd forgotten to hide. Inside was a statement from a lender. My hands started shaking before I'd even finished reading. The loan balance was far beyond anything I'd imagined, far beyond what our family could ever handle. At the bottom of the page was a date, a recent one. This wasn't old debt, it was new, and it was significant. I sat there staring at the numbers, feeling the ground beneath me give way. When Michael came home that evening, I knew our lives were about to change forever. For the first time, I finally had evidence that what was happening was more than just mistakes. This was a secret much bigger than I could have ever conceived. That night, I waited for Michael to walk through the door with a sense of dread. For years, I'd accepted his explanations. For years, I'd chosen trust over suspicion. But that piece of paper changed everything. The loan balance wasn't a few $1,000s, it was tens of thousands. There were no more logical explanations left, no forgotten bills, no temporary setbacks, and certainly no helping friends. When Michael finally entered the front door, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the statement in front of me. He saw it immediately, and the color drained from his face. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. That silence said more than any words could have. "You went through my desk," he finally said. I stared at him. That was his first concern. Not the debt, not the lies, but that I had discovered it. "Tell me what this is," I said. His shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked like a man carrying an unbearable weight. He sat across from me, his eyes glued to the table. "It's sports betting." I blinked. "What?" "Sports betting." The word sounded unreal. Michael wasn't some reckless stranger. He was a father, a husband, a pillar of the community, a little league coach, a volunteer at church fundraisers. People like Michael weren't supposed to have gambling problems. Or so I thought at the time. "It started small," he said, "just for fun." A wave of nausea hit me, because all the horror stories begin with those 4 words, just for fun. Michael explained that a coworker had introduced him to it years ago. At first, he won. A few hundred here, a few hundred there. The feeling of winning was easy, exciting, and harmless. Then he started losing. Every time he lost, he believed he could win it back. One more bet, one more game, one more weekend. I listened, stunned. Everything suddenly made sense. The missing money, the secret withdrawals, the growing debt, the strange phone calls, the tension whenever finances were mentioned. It all clicked. Yet I still couldn't process what I was hearing. "How much is owed?" I asked calmly. Michael hesitated. Then he told me. The number nearly stopped my heart. I physically felt my hands go cold. The debt was more than our savings, more than we could easily pay off, more than I could have ever dreamt. I remember standing up from the table because I couldn't sit there anymore. The room felt too small. The walls felt like they were closing in. "How could you do this to us?" I whispered. Even today, I remember the look in his eyes. Shame, genuine shame, but also desperation. "I can fix it," was all he kept saying. "I can fix it, I'll make it right." I wanted to scream. Instead, I just cried. Not because of the money, but because of the betrayal. The money was terrifying, but the lies were worse. For years, Michael had looked me in the eyes and promised me everything was fine. For years, he'd watched me work overtime, count pennies, and sacrifice small comforts for our family while he kept the truth hidden. That night was one of the longest of my life. We argued until dawn. I asked hundreds of questions, and every answer was more painful than the last. By sunrise, I learned one more thing, something that made me even more afraid. Michael had tried to quit several times already. He couldn't control himself anymore. Gambling was controlling him. That realization changed everything. The anger was still there, but suddenly it was mixed with fear. I wasn't just dealing with bad choices anymore. I was dealing with an addiction. The next few months became a cycle I wouldn't wish on anyone. Michael promised to stop. For a while he did. Things would improve, our finances would stabilize, and hope would return. Then something would happen. A football game, a basketball season, a sure-thing bet. Suddenly we were back at square one. Every time he relapsed, the damage was greater. The debt got heavier, and my trust grew weaker. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was watching two different versions of Michael exist at the same time. One was the Michael everyone knew, the charming father, the loyal husband, the reliable friend. The other was the man I saw behind closed doors, the man frantically checking scores late at night, the man terrified of hidden bills, the man desperately trying to dig his way out. They lived in the same body, and I never knew which one I'd get on any given day. Meanwhile, Ethan remained blissfully unaware. He was in high school then, bright, kind, hardworking. He idolized his father. Whenever Michael went to his baseball games, Ethan would light up. Whenever Michael praised him, he'd stand a little taller. Watching them together broke my heart because I knew Ethan only saw the best side, the side that was real, but incomplete. There were many times I considered telling him. Not everything, just enough to prepare him, enough to explain why money was always so tight, why I always looked so exhausted. But every time I was about to speak, I stopped. Because Michael would beg me, "Gwen, please don't do that to him. Don't let him see me this way." Every time, I gave in. Not because Michael deserved to be protected, but because Ethan deserved a peaceful life. Or at least that's what I told myself. Looking back, I don't know if I made the wrong choice. Maybe honesty could have saved us from years of pain. Maybe not. I'll never know. As time went on, I became the one holding everything together. I worked extra hours, I managed every bill, I negotiated payment plans, I took out new loans to pay off the old ones. I learned more about financial survival than I ever wanted to know. Sometimes I didn't feel like a wife. I felt like a crisis manager. There were many nights after everyone else was asleep that I sat alone at the kitchen table. I'd stare at spreadsheets and numbers until my eyes hurt, trying to find a way to save our family, trying to keep our home, trying to ensure Ethan could go to college one day. On those nights, Michael would often come downstairs. He'd wrap his arms around me, tell me how sorry he was, and promise things would change. Sometimes I believed him, because despite everything, I still loved him. Love doesn't disappear as quickly as trust. That's one of the cruelest truths I've ever learned. Then one afternoon, things got worse, much worse. I was at work when I got a call. The person on the other end identified themselves as a loan officer. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then he mentioned Michael's name. My heart sank. The officer explained that several payments were overdue. Not just one or two, but several. If the situation wasn't resolved, they might have to take legal action. I sat frozen at my desk. After I hung up, I locked myself in the restroom and cried, because I finally understood. The problem was much larger than Michael had admitted. That night, I confronted him again. This time, he couldn't deny it. He admitted he'd taken out one loan, then another, then another. Some were secured, some were unsecured, some I'd never even heard of. I felt my entire marriage collapsing around me. But the worst revelation came a moment later. "There's one more thing," he said. The moment those words left his mouth, I knew my life was about to change again. Whenever someone says, "There's one more thing," it's never good news. I looked at my husband, the father of my child, the man I'd loved for nearly 20 years, and for the first time in my life, I felt true dread about what he was about to tell me. "There's one more thing." The phrase stayed in my head long after Michael finished speaking. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, bracing for whatever was coming next. Part of me hoped it couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. Michael swallowed hard and looked down at his hands. "I borrowed money from family. For a second I didn't understand. Then I did. For some reason this hurt more than everything else." "Who?" I asked. Michael hesitated. That hesitation told me the answer before he even spoke. Too many people. It was too many. When he finally said the name, I felt physically ill. My sister Linda. Even then, hearing her name made me uneasy. Michael's sister had always been complicated. She could be charming when she wanted something. She could be warm when people were watching. But beneath that flawless smile was someone who kept score of everything, every favor, every slight, every benefit. Over the years, I'd learned to keep my distance. Not because we'd had an open fight, but because I never fully trusted her. "How much?" I asked. Linda had loaned him a significant amount of money over the years, not all at once, but little by little. Whenever Michael was in trouble, whenever creditors called, whenever another bad bet turned into a disaster, Linda stepped in. Or at least, that's how Michael described it. Suddenly, I understood why Linda was getting more involved in our lives, why she seemed to know more about our finances than she should, why she sometimes looked at me with strange eyes at family gatherings. She knew. She had known for years, but she never told me. The sense of betrayal was immense. "Does she know about the gambling?" Michael nodded. I closed my eyes. Of course she knew. How could she not? No one lends out that much money repeatedly without asking why. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The marriage I thought I had was disintegrating piece by piece. Every answer uncovered a new lie. Every secret exposed another layer of deception. And somehow I was expected to keep functioning, keep paying bills, keep raising Ethan, keep pretending everything was normal. Finally, I stood up. "I need some air." I went outside and sat alone on the back porch. The night air felt cold against my skin. Inside, the lights shone through the window. From the outside, we looked like any other ordinary family. A husband, a wife, a teenage son, a humble home. Nothing unusual, nothing broken. But appearances can be incredibly deceptive. That became one of the most important lessons of my life. In the years that followed, I learned how exhausting it is to live with secrets. It's not just about keeping them. It's about carrying them, managing them, and protecting them. Michael truly did try to recover. I'll give him that credit. He went to counseling, he joined a support group, and there were months, even longer, where he stayed away from gambling. For a while, I even believed the worst days were behind us, and that life had almost returned to normal. But addiction has a cruel way of hiding in the shadows, waiting patiently and quietly, then coming back when you least expect it. Every relapse caused new damage, sometimes financial, sometimes emotional, usually both. And every relapse required a new round of crisis management. By then, Ethan was in college. He was a bright young man with big dreams. Watching him leave for college was one of the proudest moments of my life. After dropping him off, I cried for an hour, not because I was sad, but because I was proud. Despite everything that happened behind the scenes, he had grown into a brilliant young man. Responsible, kind, ambitious. I wanted him to stay that way. I wanted him to focus his energy on building his future, not on cleaning up his father's mistakes. That is why I never told him. People often ask me why I stayed silent. The answer isn't simple. It's part love, part shame, part fear. But the biggest reason was Ethan. I didn't want to ruin the image he had of his father. Maybe that sounds foolish. Maybe it is. But when you're a mother, protecting your child often becomes an instinct, even if it hurts you, even if it costs you. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that Ethan at least deserved one parent he could admire without reservation. So, year after year, I carried the burden. Then, Michael's health began to change. At first it was slight fatigue, shortness of breath, occasional chest discomfort. Nothing too dramatic, nothing that immediately raised alarm bells. But gradually the symptoms worsened. The doctor suggested tests, then more appointments, then specialists. I could see the fear growing in Michael, not the fear of debt, Not the fear of creditors, but a deeper fear. The fear that he was running out of time. Around the same time, something else changed. Michael became quieter, more reflective. Sometimes I'd find him staring out the window for long periods, lost in thought, as if he were reviewing his life, calculating regrets, weighing consequences. One day after dinner, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where so many difficult conversations had taken place. His face looked much older than I remembered, tired, drawn, weary. "Gwen," he said softly, "there's something you need to know." I immediately felt tense, because conversations like this rarely ended well. But this time was different. There were no excuses, no promises, no attempts to minimize the damage. There was only honesty, or at least more honesty than I'd received in years. Michael admitted he knew how much pain he had caused. He knew how many sacrifices I'd made. He knew how much of our lives we'd spent cleaning up the disasters he'd created. His eyes were full of tears as he spoke. Despite everything, seeing him cry still broke my heart, because I remembered who he was before all of this. The young man who carried that box into my office, the man holding our newborn son in the hospital, the husband I had once trusted completely. That man hadn't entirely vanished. He was just buried under years of mistakes, but he hadn't completely disappeared. "I didn't deserve you," Michael whispered. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to agree, part of me wanted to forgive him. Another part wanted to scream. But I just sat there, listening, watching, waiting. Then he said something I will never forget. "If anything happens to me, promise me Ethan won't hate me." I stared at him. The request shocked me. "Michael, promise me," his voice choked up, "please." The room was painfully quiet. Deep down, I knew exactly what he was asking. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for protection. He wanted me to maintain the image Ethan already had of him, even after he was gone. Even if it meant I had to take the blame myself. Even if it meant I had to keep the secret forever. At the time, I didn't answer. I couldn't. The request felt too heavy, too unfair, too impossible. But life always has a way of making decisions for us in strange ways. A little over a year later, Michael had a massive heart attack. The call came early in the morning. I remember the coffee cup falling from my hand when the phone rang. I remember driving to the hospital with trembling hands. I remember praying the whole way. I remember the look on Ethan's face when he arrived, the pure fear that only a child feels when they face losing a parent. For days we stayed in the waiting room. Machines beeped and doctors spoke in guarded tones. Hope appeared, then vanished. Appeared again, then vanished again. Until finally there was no hope left. Michael Sullivan passed away 12 years before my son called me a victim at a birthday party. When we buried him, everyone was crying for a good man, a loving father, a loyal husband, a man who had buried his mistakes deep underground. I stood by his grave, carrying every secret, every debt, every sacrifice, every lie. After the funeral, while people were still hugging and wiping away tears, someone approached me with a strange look on her face. Linda, Michael's sister. She leaned in close enough to ensure no one else could hear. Then she said one sentence that changed the next 12 years of my life. After Michael's funeral, I thought the hardest part of my life would be learning how to live without him. I was wrong. The hardest part was enduring what happened next. When Linda walked toward me, the cemetery was almost empty. Most guests had left. Only the closest family remained. I was emotionally exhausted. My husband had been buried less than an hour ago. My son was devastated, and I was still trying to figure out how I would survive financially. Then Linda came up to me. At first, her voice sounded sympathetic, almost gentle. "You'd better be careful now, Gwen." I looked at her. Careful about what? She glanced at Ethan, who was talking to a friend a few yards away, and lowered her voice. "Careful he finds out the truth." My stomach tightened instantly. The words sounded strange, menacing, and deliberate. I remember staring at her without saying a word. Linda gave a faint smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "You know what I mean." Then she turned and walked away. At the time, I convinced myself that grief made me oversensitive. I wanted peace, not conflict, especially at a funeral. So I chose to ignore it. That decision cost me dearly. In the months that followed, life became a blur of responsibilities. Michael was gone, but the bills weren't, the debt wasn't, the mortgage wasn't, and the medical bills certainly weren't. Every day felt like a battle. I worked extra hours, spent late nights reviewing files, negotiated with creditors, balanced accounts, and made difficult financial decisions. Through it all, I shielded Ethan from the worst of it. He was 20, still in college, still immersed in grief, still trying to understand life without his father. I couldn't bear to add to his pain, so I carried it all myself. At first, after Michael died, Ethan and I became closer. We talked frequently, sometimes several times a day. When he came home for breaks, we would sit for hours, sharing memories, funny stories, favorite vacations, and moments we'd almost forgotten. Some nights we laughed through tears, and some nights we cried together. Those memories were precious to me because they reminded me that there was a time when my son trusted me completely. Before doubt entered his mind, before someone poisoned his view of me, the change started gradually. So gradually that I barely noticed it. An odd comment here, an unusual question there, nothing dramatic, at least not at first. About 6 months after Michael died, Ethan called me one afternoon. His tone seemed different, more guarded, more serious. "Mom," he said, "did Dad leave behind life insurance?" The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly, "Yes." There was a pause on the other end, then another question. "How much?" I remember feeling a slight discomfort, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because the question felt unusual. But I told him the truth, a rough number. Another silence, longer this time. Finally, he said, "Okay," and quickly changed the subject. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now I know exactly what was happening. That conversation wasn't initiated by Ethan. It started with Linda. A few weeks later, another strange conversation occurred. Ethan came home for the weekend. We were having lunch together. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Then he asked a question that felt extremely specific, almost casually. "Did Dad owe people money?" My fork stopped in midair. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The honest answer was, yes, a lot of money. But I had promised Michael. More importantly, I still believed protecting Ethan was the right thing to do. "Why do you ask?" I countered. Ethan shrugged. "No reason." But I knew there had to be a reason. People don't ask questions like that for no reason. Something had started, something I couldn't see. And because I couldn't see it, I couldn't stop it. Over the next few years, Linda became more deeply involved in Ethan's life. She called him often, invited him to dinner, spent holidays with him, and positioned herself as a second parent. At first, I was grateful. I really was. I thought she was helping him process his grief, helping him maintain ties to his father's side of the family. I had no idea she was quietly rewriting history. One conversation, one hint, one lie at a time. The first noticeable crack appeared when Ethan graduated from college. We were celebrating at a restaurant. The room was full of family. Everyone seemed happy. Then someone commented on how hard I'd worked to put Ethan through school. Before I could respond, Linda let out a soft laugh. "Oh, Gwen had a lot of help." The words sounded innocent, but there was something in her tone that made me uncomfortable. I noticed Ethan glance at her, a quick look as if they shared some private understanding. The moment passed, but it stayed with me because I felt like I'd missed part of the conversation. Time marched on. Ethan built a successful career. He met Rachel, fell in love, and got engaged. Throughout this process, I was always proud of him. I attended every milestone, every celebration, every achievement. I never stopped being his biggest supporter. But subtle things kept changing. He called less, visited less, and shared less. At first, I blamed it on adulthood. People get busy, life gets complicated, families get larger. That's normal. But eventually, the distance became impossible to ignore, especially after he married Rachel. Rachel wasn't a bad person. I have to make that clear. She was bright, successful, and independent. She loved Ethan. The problem wasn't Rachel. The problem was what she was hearing and who she was hearing it from. Linda became very close with her very quickly. Too close. Family gatherings often ended with the two of them sitting together whispering. Sometimes they'd stop when I approached. Sometimes they wouldn't. But I could feel a shift. A narrative was being formed. A story was being fabricated. A story where I wasn't the hero, where I wasn't even neutral. A story where I was the problem. Then came the first accusation. Not direct, not sharp, but painful enough. It happened at a Thanksgiving dinner. Rachel mentioned how hard grief can be on a family. Before I could speak, Ethan sighed. Then he said something that shocked me. "Mom never really moved on." The room went quiet. I gave an awkward smile. "What is that supposed to mean?" Ethan shrugged. "You know." No, I don't. He looked uncomfortable, but he said it anyway. It feels like you enjoy being the grieving widow. The words felt like a slap in the face. Everyone else looked uncomfortable. Rachel looked down immediately. Linda remained completely silent, but I noticed something. She wasn't surprised, not even a little bit, because she had heard these thoughts before. Maybe this was the seed she had planted herself. That night, after everyone had left, I sat alone in the living room. The house was painfully quiet. I kept replaying Ethan's words. Enjoy being the grieving widow. The statement made no sense. There was nothing to enjoy about grief. There was nothing to enjoy about carrying Michael's secrets. There was nothing to enjoy about spending years paying off his debts. Yet somehow my son believed it. A terrifying possibility entered my mind for the first time. For years, someone had been talking to him. Someone had been feeding him an untrue version of our story. I just didn't know how much damage had already been done, or how bad it would get. Because while I was trying to protect my son's memory of his father, someone else was slowly destroying his trust in his mother. And by the time I finally realized who was behind it, the damage was already immense. If I've learned anything about broken relationships, it's that they rarely collapse all at once. They are eroded slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. By the time you realize how much damage has been done, the entire foundation is already gone. That is exactly what happened between Ethan and me. After that Thanksgiving dinner, I told myself not to overreact. People say hurtful things. Families go through difficult times. Maybe Ethan was under too much pressure. Maybe grief was still lurking beneath the surface. Maybe I was imagining problems that didn't exist. I wanted to believe those explanations. Unfortunately, reality had other plans. In the years that followed, the distance between us continued to grow. Not through dramatic arguments, not through explosive conflict, but through hundreds of tiny moments, missed calls, shorter conversations, less warmth, drained patience, lost trust. Sometimes the changes were subtle enough that I doubted my own judgment, but other times they were impossible to ignore. One afternoon I called Ethan, just wanting to check in. Rachel answered his phone. She sounded polite but distant. After a brief conversation, she said something that stayed with me. Ethan has been under a lot of pressure lately. I know, I replied. I just wanted to make sure he was all right. There was a pause. Then she said, sometimes I feel like he thinks he's responsible for your happiness. The comment caught me off guard. Responsible for my happiness? I hadn't asked Ethan to manage my emotions. I didn't call him every day. I didn't demand his attention. In fact, I often went weeks without hearing from him at all. And yet, this was the perception forming around me. A needy mother, a burden, a woman with impossible expectations. After I hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen, trying to figure out where that idea came from. Because it certainly didn't come from me. As time passed, I started noticing something else. Linda's influence had become impossible to hide. Every major misunderstanding seemed to trace back to her. Every conflict seemed to contain fragments of language that sounded suspiciously familiar. Talk of control, talk of guilt, talk of manipulation. These were words Linda had been using quietly for years. Now, Ethan was repeating them. At first, he used them carefully and indirectly. Eventually, it became more open. One Christmas, we were discussing family traditions. The conversation should have been pleasant. Instead, it became a painful affair. I mentioned how much Michael used to love decorating the house. The moment the words were out, Ethan let out a heavy sigh. I still remember that sound. The irritation, the impatience, the exhaustion, as if he'd heard enough. As always, he muttered. I looked at him. What does that mean? He rubbed his forehead. Everything always comes back to Dad. The atmosphere in the room turned awkward. Rachel stared into her coffee cup. Linda, yet again, maintained a strange silence. Just watching, observing, never correcting, never stepping in, never helping. I swallowed hard. Your father was my husband and he passed away. Ethan shook his head. I know, but sometimes it feels like you use that. The word stunned me. Use that. Using my husband's death. Using my grief. Using my loss. I honestly didn't know how to respond. The accusation felt so detached from reality that I couldn't process it. What was I supposed to be getting out of it? Sympathy? Attention? Control? The idea seemed absurd, and yet my son clearly believed it. Belief is powerful, especially after it has been nurtured for years. That night, after everyone left, I cried for hours. Not because of what Ethan said, but because of what it revealed. The son who once trusted me without reservation was starting to see me through someone else's eyes, and I didn't know how to stop it. Things got worse after Rachel and Ethan had their daughter, Emily. Becoming a grandparent should have been one of the happiest chapters of my life. In many ways, it was. Emily was wonderful, bright, kind, curious. She reminded me of Ethan when he was little. For a while, spending time with her helped fill the void created elsewhere, but even those relationships became complicated. Not because of Emily, but because of the adults around her. I noticed Ethan becoming increasingly protective about boundaries. Again, boundaries aren't the problem. Healthy boundaries are important. The problem was the assumptions behind them. Every request I made was viewed as suspicious. Every suggestion became evidence of interference. Every attempt to help was somehow twisted into criticism. There is one instance I remember vividly. Rachel had just gone back to work, and Emily was about 8. They were struggling to balance their schedules. One evening I offered to help, that was all. If it would make things easier for you, I could pick Emily up from school a few days a week. The offer came from love, from genuine care, and from a desire to support my family. Ethan's reaction shocked me. "We don't need you to manage our lives." The words hit me like a punch. I stared at him, confused. I wasn't trying to manage anything. I was just offering to help. He crossed his arms. "You always do this." "Always do what?" The question echoed in my mind because I truly didn't understand. Rachel quickly changed the subject. The conversation was over, but the hurt remained. Driving home that night, I cried in the car. Not because he rejected my help, but because he assigned motives to me that didn't exist. Somewhere along the way, my actions were no longer being read through a lens of love. Now they were filtered through a lens of suspicion. Time continued to pass. Linda kept talking, Ethan kept listening, and I continued to stay silent. Looking back, that silence was likely my biggest mistake. Not because I owed anyone an explanation, but because when the truth refuses to defend itself, lies grow stronger. I always thought the truth would eventually come out, that people would see the reality, that character would prove everything. But the opposite happened. The absence of truth provided space for false stories to grow, and they flourished. By the time Emily was in high school, Ethan's view of me had shifted dramatically. I was no longer just his mother. I had become a symbol, a collection of assumptions, a version of Gwen Sullivan that existed primarily in his head. A person who manipulated others by making them feel guilty, someone who enjoyed being pitied, someone who exaggerated pain, someone who controlled others emotionally. The tragedy is that none of it was true. Yet, when repeated enough, even absurd lies can start to sound convincing, especially when they come from someone you trust. Then came a conversation that nearly broke me. It happened about a year before Emily's 16th birthday. I invited Ethan to lunch, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in a long time. At first, everything seemed pleasant. We talked about work, Emily's grades, and daily life. Then somehow the topic turned to family finances. Suddenly, Ethan said something that made my blood run cold. "You know, Aunt Linda told me something very interesting." When he said her name, I felt a tension spread through my chest. "What was it?" He looked straight at me. "She said Dad left behind enough money to take care of everyone." I immediately understood where this was heading. The insurance money, the same lie, still alive, still spreading, still poisoning everything. "And?" I asked cautiously. Ethan leaned back. His expression wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed, like a person finally accepting something unpleasant. Sometimes I wonder where that money actually went. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe, not because I didn't have the answer, but because I suddenly realized how deep the hurt went. My own son actually believed I might have stolen his money. After everything, every sacrifice, every debt paid, every sleepless night, every promise I kept, he believed I might have taken the money that belonged to our family. In that moment, I finally understood something terrifying. Linda wasn't just turning Ethan against me. She had spent years replacing reality with fabricated stories, planting carefully calculated seeds one by one. Unless something changed, eventually those lies would grow large enough to destroy everything that remained of our family. Worst of all, I still hadn't told anyone the truth, not yet. But that moment was approaching, much sooner than I thought. Because the next time Ethan openly questioned my character, something inside me would finally reach its limit. The night Ethan told me to stop playing the victim, I drove home in total silence. After my declaration, the birthday party ended quickly. No one knew what to say. Rachel looked shocked. Emily looked confused. Linda looked nervous. And Ethan looked angry. Not the kind of anger that explodes, but a self-righteous anger. The anger of someone who believes they've finally spoken the truth. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at my dark house. I felt exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. 12 years of silence, 12 years of carrying secrets, 12 years of protecting people who hadn't protected me. For what? To be called a manipulator, to be accused of playing the victim, to be treated like a thief for the first time. I stopped asking myself if revealing the truth would hurt others. Instead, I began to ask if hiding the truth had already caused them even greater harm. Finally, I got out of the car and went inside. The house felt the same as always, quiet, lonely, still. Michael had been gone for over a decade, but traces of him remained everywhere. Photos, books, the old tools in the garage, reminders of the tiny life that once existed. I stood in the living room, staring at a framed photo of our family. Michael stood between Ethan and me. We were all laughing, looking happy, looking complete. The photo stung, not because it was fake, but because it was only partially true. We had been happy, but we had also been hiding. And eventually what is hidden always demands to be brought to light. I walked upstairs toward the attic. I hadn't been up there in years, not really, only to store Christmas decorations or old boxes. But I knew exactly where I was going. Near the back wall sat a large gray storage bin. Dust covered the lid. The plastic looked older than I remembered. For a long time, I just stared at it. That box contained 12 years of silence. Every secret, every sacrifice, every lie, everything. My hands were shaking as I pulled it toward me. When I opened it, the lid creaked. Inside were folders, envelopes, bank statements, medical records, letters, receipts, loan documents, evidence of a lifetime. Evidence I had hoped I would never need to use. Evidence I had kept regardless. Maybe part of me always knew this day would come. I carried the box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. Then I began to organize what was inside. The first folder contained financial records, years of them, payment confirmations, debt settlements, bank withdrawal records, insurance bills. Each one was meticulously organized. I gave a bitter laugh. The old accountant in me had never disappeared. When chaos erupted, keeping records became my survival mechanism. When everything else felt out of control, paperwork gave me structure, evidence, facts, and reality. And reality was becoming very important. Because for years, people had been living in a fantasy. In this fantasy, Michael was flawless. In this fantasy, Gwen Sullivan was selfish. In this fantasy, the money vanished. In this fantasy, grief was just a performance. That fantasy was about to end. Document after document brought back painful memories. Hospital bills, mortgage payments, credit card settlements, debt agreements. I remembered every sacrifice attached to those papers. The vacations we never took, the missing retirement savings. The second job I worked for nearly 2 years. The nights I cried quietly so Ethan wouldn't hear. Every piece of paper carried a story, and every story carried a cost. Hours passed. The house outside grew darker. Rain began to tap gently against the window. Still, I continued to organize. Then I found the insurance records, the documents Ethan believed I had hidden, the documents that were supposedly proof of my greed. I laughed bitterly to myself. If only he knew. The payout on paper looked substantial. But after paying off the debts, what was left? Almost nothing. Most people never saw that part. They heard the initial number and stopped listening. They imagined wealth, security, freedom. The reality was vastly different. Michael's debts consumed a large portion of it. Medical bills consumed more. Mortgage obligations consumed even more. By the time everything was settled, there wasn't much money left. Certainly not enough to justify the accusations Ethan believed. I placed the insurance records in a separate pile. Those would be very important later. Next, I found something I hadn't looked at in years. A thick envelope with Linda's name written on it. My stomach tightened instantly. For a second I hesitated. Then I opened it. Inside were check copies, loan records, handwritten notes. Suddenly, memories came flooding back. Those loans, the money Michael borrowed, the agreements they made. I slowly examined every document, dates, amounts, signatures. Everything was there. far exceeding what I remembered, and far exceeding what Linda probably remembered. A cold realization slowly washed over me. Linda hadn't just known about Michael's gambling. She had been deeply involved in it, far deeper than anyone realized. If Ethan saw these documents, her carefully constructed narrative would collapse instantly. For years, she had portrayed herself as the concerned sister, the protector of the family, the one defending Michael's memory. But these documents showed a different situation, a much uglier one. I set the envelope aside. That conversation could wait. One folder remained, the hardest one to face. I recognized it immediately. Michael's handwriting covered the cover. Just seeing it brought tears to my eyes. I sat down slowly. The room felt very quiet suddenly, almost sacred, because I knew what was inside. Letters. Several letters he had written in the final months of his life. Most were written to me. Some contained financial instructions. Some contained apologies. Things he felt were easier to write than to say. For years, I had avoided reading them. Not because I forgot they existed, but because they were too painful. Now, I carefully opened the folder. The paper felt fragile under my fingers. I read one letter, then another. Each brought back memories. Some painful, some beautiful, some heartbreaking. Michael wasn't a villain. That would have been simpler. Villains are easy. Michael was far more complex. He was a man who loved his family but was deeply flawed, a man who made terrible choices, a man who caused massive damage, and a man who felt deep remorse. All of these things were true. Maybe that was why I had stayed silent for so long, because the truth is rarely simple. Then, near the bottom of the folder, I found something I had almost forgotten, a sealed envelope. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to me. My breath hitched. On the front, in Michael's familiar handwriting, were 4 words. For Ethan. My hands began to tremble. I remembered this envelope now. It was years ago after Michael passed, and I couldn't bring myself to open it, nor could I bring myself to destroy it. So I stored it away and forgot about it. Or perhaps I chose to forget. I slowly picked it up. The paper had yellowed slightly with time. 12 years. This letter had waited for 12 years. 12 years during which Ethan had constructed a version of his father that didn't fully exist. 12 years during which Linda had tampered with history. 12 years during which I had borne the blame. I stared at the envelope for a long time. Then I carefully opened it. As I unfolded the letter inside, my heart hammered, because I suddenly realized something. This wasn't just another letter. This was likely the only piece of evidence that could change everything. Not because it came from me, but because it came from Michael himself. And the words he had written on those pages were about to change the entire story my family believed. The signed acknowledgement sat on my kitchen table like a loaded weapon. I'd read it maybe 20 times, maybe more. Each time I reached the same conclusion. Linda Harper hadn't spent years lying because she wanted to. She had done it because the truth was a far greater threat to her than it ever was to me. For over a decade, I had assumed she just didn't like me. Maybe she resented me or blamed me for Michael's mistakes or just loved the drama. Those explanations felt plausible. Now I realized the truth was much darker. Linda wasn't protecting Michael's legacy. She was protecting herself. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat back down to look over the files. Outside, the morning sun was rising. I'd barely slept, but the exhaustion no longer mattered. For the first time in years, all the pieces finally fit. The acknowledgement was signed 8 months before Michael died. It clearly stated that Linda owed Michael money, not the other way around. And it wasn't a small amount. It was a significant sum, far more than I had ever known. Attached to the document were copies of checks, transfer records, and handwritten notes. The closer I looked, the more disturbing the picture became. For years, Ethan had been told that Linda helped Michael financially, that she had rescued him from debt time and again, and that she had made sacrifices for her brother. That story was partially true, but it wasn't even close to the whole picture. According to the records in front of me, there was another side to the arrangement. Linda had been borrowing from Michael for years, thousands here, large amounts there, always with a promise to pay it back. Apparently, she never honored those promises. A memory surfaced unexpectedly, one I'd almost forgotten. About 15 years ago, Michael and I attended a family barbecue at Linda's house. At one point, I overheard an argument between them near the garage. It wasn't loud, just a tense whisper. When Michael came back, he looked frustrated, and Linda looked embarrassed. When I asked him about it later, he brushed it off. Just family stuff. At the time, I believed him. Now, I suspect that argument was about money. Perhaps many of their private conversations had been about money. As I sifted through the files, more memories emerged. Little moments and details that seemed meaningless at the time now held weight. I remembered Linda frequently asking Michael for help, a temporary loan, emergency assistance, help with repairs, help paying bills. Michael rarely said no. It was one of his greatest strengths and his biggest weakness. He found it impossible to refuse people, even when helping them hurt his own family, especially when it came to his own blood. The realization left a bitter taste in my mouth. While Michael's gambling had caused massive damage, he wasn't the only one making irresponsible decisions. Others had taken advantage of his inability to say no. People had been using him, and Linda seemed to be at the top of that list. I reached for another document, a handwritten note from Michael. It was short, simple, and undoubtedly authentic. The note mentioned a repayment plan Linda had agreed to follow. She never followed it. I checked the dates. Nothing. There were no records of payments afterward, no proof of her adhering to the plan. Only promises. Broken promises. Suddenly, the timeline became crystal clear. If Ethan discovered Linda owed Michael money, it would lead to several uncomfortable questions. Questions she couldn't easily answer. Questions like, why didn't you pay him back? Why did you tell everyone he was financially dependent on you? Why did you spend years criticizing Gwen? Why did you hide this? The answers would expose her, and Linda clearly understood that. So, instead of defending herself, she had fabricated another story, a safer story, one with a convenient villain. And that villain was me. The more I thought about it, the more it all made sense. The comments, the rumors, the subtle digs, the carefully planted seeds of doubt, none of it happened overnight. It was cultivated slowly, patiently, and strategically, like a gardener planting seeds and waiting for them to sprout. And they did sprout. By the time Ethan was an adult, those seeds had turned into beliefs. Deep-seated, dangerous beliefs. The phone rang, making me jump. It was my brother, Robert, one of the few people who knew part of the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I picked up immediately. Good morning, you sound tired, Robert said. I am. He paused. Was the birthday party really that bad? I gave a bitter chuckle. Worse. After a short silence, I told him everything. The argument, Ethan's accusations, and my decision to finally lay the truth out. Robert listened quietly. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. I've been waiting years for this conversation. I wasn't surprised. Robert had urged me to speak up more times than I could count. You protected everyone except yourself, he said. I know. No, Gwen, I don't think you do. His voice softened. You protected Michael. Yes. You protected Ethan. Yes. You even protected Linda. I closed my eyes because he was right. Somehow, by staying silent, I allowed the other version of events to survive. Even when those versions hurt me, even when they were lies. Robert continued, You have to understand, Ethan only knew the story he was told. The statement hit me hard, because behind my anger lay another painful truth. Ethan wasn't born believing these things. He was taught them over and over for years. That didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped explain it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, I told Robert about the files, every piece of evidence, the loans, the notes, the acknowledgments, the proof. His reaction was immediate. My God, okay. Do you have everything still? Every single piece? Yes. Good. I could hear a resolve in his voice now, a resolve I was starting to feel myself. Then, it's time. It's time. What a simple phrase, yet it filled me with dread. Because once the truth is spoken, it can't be unsaid. The family would change, relationships would change, everything would change. Part of me was still terrified of what was to come. What if Ethan refused to believe me? What if Rachel defended Linda? What if the family fell apart? What if exposing the truth caused even more pain? Robert seemed to sense my hesitation. Gwen? Yeah? This family is already broken. The words landed heavily on me because they were true. I wasn't risking a healthy family. I was facing a family that was already damaged, only the damage had been kept hidden. Just like Michael's gambling had been hidden. Just like Linda's lies had been hidden. Just like my sacrifices had been hidden. And the truth doesn't create the problem, the truth reveals it. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a few minutes, thinking, remembering, preparing. Then, another thought entered my mind. Emily, my granddaughter. Unlike the adults, Emily still approached life with honesty, curiosity, and fairness. And lately, I'd noticed something interesting. She had started asking questions, small, cautious questions. They were questions that showed she wasn't fully buying the family narrative. A memory from her birthday party surfaced. Just before the argument, Emily had whispered something to me. "Grandma, why does Aunt Linda always get so angry whenever anyone talks about Grandpa's money?" At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now I realized it was important, very important. Children often notice things adults miss. Emily had been observing for years, perhaps longer than anyone realized. The thought gave me a glimmer of hope. Not because Emily could fix anything, but because the truth often leaves clues. Even when people try their hardest to cover it up, those clues start surfacing in unexpected places. By the evening, my decision was final. No more silence, no more protecting lies, no more bearing the blame. I picked up the phone. I started reaching out to the family one by one. Ethan, Rachel, Robert, and a few others, including Linda. The message was simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. I was inviting everyone over to my house next weekend. There were some important things they needed to hear, things that should have been said a long time ago. Most responded politely. Some sounded confused. A few sounded nervous. But one response stood out above the rest. Linda. She called within minutes. When I heard the tension in her voice, I knew one thing. She was afraid. For the first time in 12 years, Linda Harper was scared. And that meant she already suspected what I intended to do. The week before the family meeting felt like the longest of my life. Every day stretched out infinitely. Every hour passed with agonizing slowness. Every night I lay in bed, unable to sleep, imagining how things might unfold. For 12 years I had hidden the truth. Now I was preparing to lay it out before everyone. There was no turning back, no backing down, no more silence. The morning of the meeting, the sky was gray. Rain clouds hung low over Columbus. I woke up before dawn and made coffee. Not because I wanted it, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The dining table was covered with neatly arranged folders, each labeled, each containing a piece of a story no one knew the full scope of. Insurance records, debt records, mortgage documents, college expenses, Michael's letters, Linda's records, and finally, that letter for Ethan, the letter that might change everything. I looked at the stacks of files, feeling the weight of 12 years pressing against my chest. At 10 o'clock, I started tidying the house, adding chairs, preparing water glasses and coffee. There was no elaborate setup. This wasn't a celebration. It wasn't even a real family gathering. It was a reckoning. By noon, my stomach was in knots. At 1 o'clock, the first car pulled into the driveway. It was Robert, my brother. He walked through the front door with the calm confidence that always managed to settle me. As soon as he saw my face, he hugged me. "Ready?" "No." He smiled gently. "Good." I couldn't help but smile. What does that mean? "It means you're taking this seriously." His gaze shifted to the folders. "You don't need to win today." "I don't know." He shook his head. "You just need to tell the truth." For some reason, the words steadied my nerves because he was right. I wasn't here to ruin anyone. I wasn't here to punish anyone. I wasn't here to seek revenge. I was just here to stop the lies. Even if those lies were originally told with good intentions. Just past 2 o'clock, Rachel and Ethan arrived. I watched them through the front window. Ethan got out of the driver's seat, Rachel right behind him. Both looked unhappy. Both looked tense. The atmosphere was palpable. As soon as Ethan walked in, he noticed the folders. His expression changed instantly. "What are these?" His tone was defensive, guarded. I took a deep breath. "Let's talk when everyone gets here." He looked restless, but he sat down anyway. Rachel sat quietly beside him. For a while, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavy, uncomfortable. Then another car arrived. Emily. A few minutes later, she rushed into the house. Unlike the adults, she didn't try to hide her emotions. She looked nervous, curious, and worried. She hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandma." The unexpected words almost brought me to tears. I hugged her back. "I love you too." When she let go, I noticed Ethan watching us. Something flickered across his face. Guilt? Hesitation? It was gone as quickly as it appeared. The last guest arrived 15 minutes later, Linda. The moment I saw her step out of her car, I knew she understood exactly why she was here. Her confidence seemed forced, her smile rehearsed. When she walked inside, her eyes immediately shifted toward the folders. She froze. Just for a split second, but I noticed it. Robert noticed it too. Linda recovered quickly. Too quickly. "What are these?" she asked, the same question Ethan had. "Interesting," I replied simply. "You'll see soon enough." After that, no one felt comfortable. Everyone took their seats. The room felt smaller than usual, tighter. The air itself seemed charged. I looked around the table. My son, my granddaughter, my daughter-in-law, my brother, and my late husband's sister. The most important people, and the people who had hurt me the most. Somehow, they were the same group. For a moment, fear almost made me retreat. What if this ended badly? What if the truth wasn't enough? What if years of lies proved stronger than evidence? Then I remembered the birthday party. I remembered Ethan's voice. "Stop playing the victim." The pain returned instantly, and with it, clarity. I wasn't doing this because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. I clasped my hands together. Then I began. "Thank you all for coming." No one responded. The silence remained. "I asked you all here because there are things that should have been said years ago." Ethan shifted in his chair. Linda crossed her arms. Rachel looked down. Emily listened intently. "I've spent 12 years keeping promises." I looked straight at Ethan. Some of those promises protected people I loved. I looked at Linda. And others protected people who didn't deserve it. Linda's jaw tightened, just a little, but it was noticeable. The room grew even quieter. I continued. "At Emily's birthday party, Ethan accused me of playing the victim." My son's face flushed. "Mom, don't." I held up a hand. "Just this once, you are going to let me finish." The firmness in my voice surprised even me. Ethan closed his mouth immediately. I had spent years avoiding conflict, years backing down, years choosing peace over arguments. Today was different. Today, I intended to finish what I had started. I opened the first folder, the insurance records. I want everyone to understand one thing. I pushed the copies to the center of the table. These are the actual records of Michael's life insurance policy. Rachel picked up her copy. Emily leaned in to look. Ethan looked skeptical. Linda looked uneasy. I continued, "For years there have been hints that I kept this money for myself." No one spoke, no one denied it, because everyone knew exactly who had been hinting at it. I pointed to the documents. "Read them." The room was filled with the sound of rustling paper. Minutes passed. Rachel frowned, then frowned even deeper. Emily's eyes widened. Ethan kept reading, his expression slowly changing, confusion replacing certainty. Meanwhile, Linda remained completely still, too still. I recognized the posture, a person calculating, preparing, realizing things were no longer under their control. When everyone had finished reading the documents, I spoke again. "This is where the money went." I pointed to the highlighted sections. "The mortgage." I pointed to another section. "The medical debt." Another section. "Creditors." Another. "Ethan's college expenses." Silence. Pure, absolute silence. The kind that only appears when long-held assumptions start to collapse. Ethan was the first to look up. Most of the confidence had drained from his face. "I didn't know." The words were soft, almost reflexive. I nodded. "I know. Because he didn't." That was the tragedy. It wasn't that he hated me, but that he had hated me without knowing the truth. But we were only getting started. The insurance records were just the beginning. I opened another folder, then another. I laid out 12 years of reality, one page at a time. Every sacrifice, every payment, every debt, every hidden burden. With every page turned, the room grew quieter, until finally no one spoke. Not even Linda. Then I reached for the final folder, the one I had saved for last. The one containing the records directly related to her, the one that explained everything. The moment my hand touched it, I saw fear flash across Linda's face. Genuine fear. It was the first authentic emotion she had shown all afternoon. In that instant, I knew one thing. She already knew what was inside. As I picked up the final folder, the atmosphere in the room shifted. I saw it. Not in words, but written on everyone's faces. Ethan leaned forward. Rachel sat up straighter. Emily stopped turning pages. Robert crossed his arms and waited quietly. And Linda? Linda looked terrified. Not nervous, not uncomfortable, but terrified. For 12 years, she had controlled the narrative. For 12 years, she had guided the conversation, planted doubt, and shaped other people's perceptions. For 12 years, she had trusted that I would stay silent. Now she wasn't so sure. I slowly opened the folder. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft friction of paper. "I've shown you where the insurance money went." I looked straight at Ethan. "I've shown you the debt." I looked around. "I've shown you the mortgage records." Then I placed several documents in front of everyone. "Now, I'm going to show you something else." Linda shifted in her seat, a slight movement but clearly visible. My voice remained calm. "For years, I've heard the same story." I paused. "The story that says Linda helped Michael financially, over and over." No one interrupted. "The story that says Michael was dependent on her." Another pause. "The story that says I somehow profited while others sacrificed." I pushed the documents forward. "Those stories aren't complete." Rachel picked up the first page. Her eyes narrowed immediately, then widened. She looked at the next page, then the next. Ethan followed suit. Emily leaned in even closer. The silence became almost unbearable. Finally, Rachel looked up. "What is this?" I answered calmly, "Proof that Linda borrowed money from Michael." No one moved. No one breathed. At least, that's what it felt like. Rachel looked down again. Ethan grabbed another file, then another. His face slowly drained of color. The evidence was undeniable. Cancelled checks, signed acknowledgments, handwritten agreements, dates, amounts, signatures, facts, the things that lies fear the most. Linda finally spoke. "That proves nothing." The words came out too quickly, too defensively. I looked at her. "It proves you borrowed money." She crossed her arms. "Michael borrowed money from me too." "Yes." Her confidence returned a little. "See?" she said, pointing at me. "See?" I nodded. "Yes, he did borrow from you." Her expression changed. She clearly hadn't expected me to agree. I wasn't there to trade half-truths. I wasn't there to replace one lie with another. Michael did borrow from Linda. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. And that was the point. I reached for another document. "Michael borrowed from you." I laid it on the table. "And you borrowed from him?" Another document. And another, and another, and another. I pointed to the dates. The difference is, Michael kept track of everything. No one spoke. The room felt frozen as I continued. "For years, Linda let everyone believe she was just helping her brother." I looked straight at Ethan. "But she never told you that she owed him money, too." Ethan slowly turned his head toward his aunt. His expression had shifted completely. Confusion, disbelief, suspicion. For the first time, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. Linda noticed immediately and panic flashed across her face. "You're twisting things." "I'm not," I shook my head. "The files speak for themselves." Then I reached for the letter. The letter Michael had written to Ethan. The room went quiet. Even Robert looked emotional. I held the envelope carefully. The paper was old, fragile, 12 years old. I'd waited 12 years for this moment. Ethan stared at it. "What is that?" My throat tightened. "A letter from your father." His face went pale. The silence in the room was absolute. I continued. "He wrote this before he passed away." Ethan swallowed hard. "You never told me." "I know." My voice was slightly raspy. "I couldn't. That was the truth. For years I couldn't rip open the old wounds, couldn't re-examine that kind of pain. Maybe part of me was afraid. Maybe part of me was trying to protect him. Maybe it was both." I unfolded the letter. My hands were shaking, and then I began to read. The first few lines were simple. Michael told Ethan how much he loved him, how proud he was of him, and that being his father was the greatest blessing of his life. By the second paragraph, Rachel was already crying. Emily wiped tears from her eyes. Even Ethan looked deeply shaken. Then, the tone shifted. It became more serious, more personal, more honest. Finally, Michael wrote the words that changed everything. "Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm surely gone. There are things you deserve to know. Your mother spent years shielding me from the consequences of my own choices." The room froze. I kept reading. "She carried the burden that should have been mine. She paid the debts I owed. She cleaned up the messes I made. She did it because she loved our home." Tears blurred my vision. I kept reading. Michael's words filled the room, raw, painful, unvarnished. He described his gambling, his shame, his failures, his regrets. He held nothing back, and he didn't sugarcoat a thing. Then came the sentence that shattered the illusion Ethan had carried for 12 years. "If there is anyone who deserves your respect, it is your mother. Not because she is perfect, but because when leaving was the easier choice, she chose to stay." Rachel covered her mouth. Emily was openly weeping. Robert stared at the table. And Ethan looked completely undone. But the letter wasn't over. The final part was the heaviest blow. I know she might choose to protect my reputation. If she does, please remember that this protection wasn't something I earned, but something she gave. Please never punish her for it. When I finished, the words lingered in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence felt endless. Then I set the letter down. My hands were trembling, my heart racing. 12 years of carrying this truth. Now it was finally out. No more secrets, no more assumptions, no more protecting lies. The room remained still. Finally, Rachel whispered, "Oh my God." No one answered, because there was nothing left to say. The truth had said it all. Then, something unexpected happened. Emily stood up. She walked around the table and hugged me tightly. No hesitation, no questions, no conditions. The gesture nearly broke me. I hugged her back as tears streamed down my face. Over her shoulder, I saw Ethan staring at the letter. Still staring at it, as if rereading it over and over in his mind. Every accusation, every assumption, every judgment, every harsh word, all of it colliding with reality. Finally, he looked slowly and deliberately at Linda. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Linda avoided his gaze. For the first time in my life, I saw her speechless, unable to explain, unable to control the conversation. "Ethan," she began. He cut her off. "No." The word shocked everyone, including me. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. His eyes were red, his hands shaking. When he looked at me, I barely recognized the expression on his face. The anger was gone. The certainty was gone. The judgment was gone. What remained was something worse. A breakdown. The breakdown of a son realizing how wrong he had been. For a very, very long time, how horribly wrong. Then, he looked back down at the letter, and I knew the hardest part of today was only just beginning. I had imagined this moment so many times. In some versions, Ethan was angry. In others, he denied everything. Sometimes he stormed out. Sometimes he defended Linda. But I had never imagined this scene. I had never imagined the absolute silence. After reading Michael's letter, the room felt frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the sound of rain tapping against the window sounded louder than before. Ethan stood by his chair, staring at the pages before him. His father's words, his father's confession, his father's apology, his father's truth. For 12 years he had carried a version of Michael that no longer existed. A perfect father, a flawless man, a victim. Now that image was crumbling, and I could see the collapse on his face. Part of me wanted to comfort him. The maternal instinct in me remained, and always would. But another part of me was still wounded, deeply wounded. Because while Ethan was discovering the painful truth today, I had lived with those truths alone for so many years. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. She turned to Ethan. "Ethan!" Her voice was hoarse. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the letter. Then he looked at me. The look in his eyes nearly shattered my heart, because for the first time in years, I saw the little boy I used to know. Not the angry man, not the judgmental son. The boy who was lost, confused, heartbroken. "Mom." The word came out barely as a whisper. I swallowed hard. Neither of us knew what to do next. Then Ethan looked around the room, looking at the files, looking at Robert, looking at Emily, looking at Linda, and finally, his gaze settled back on me. Are all of these true?" The question wasn't hostile, wasn't accusatory. It was desperate. A man clinging to the last remnants of certainty. I nodded slowly. Every word. He lowered his head again, then looked back at the letter, then back at me, as if hoping reality might somehow change. As if reading it enough times would produce a different result. It didn't. The truth remained, immovable and unrelenting. Rachel reached out to take his hand. He didn't seem to notice at all. Seconds passed, then a minute, then another. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I accused you." No one answered. "I blamed you." Still no one answered. His voice began to shake. "I blamed you for things Dad actually did." The room stayed quiet. Because there was nothing to refute, nothing to explain, nothing to soften, only the truth. Then Ethan looked straight at Linda. The atmosphere changed instantly. The confusion on his face turned into something else. Understanding. And understanding can be very painful. "Aunt Linda." She looked uncomfortable. "Ethan, listen. When did you know?" The question hit like a hammer. Linda shifted in her seat immediately. "What do you mean?" Ethan's voice hardened. When did you know about these things? No answer. When did you know that Mom paid off the debts? Silence. When did you know the insurance money went into the house and my college expenses? Still silence. For the first time in years, Linda had no prepared narrative, no ready explanation, no villain on hand. The spotlight was finally on her, and she hated the feeling. I was trying to protect your father's memory. The excuse sounded thin the moment it left her lips. Everyone knew it, especially Ethan. His eyes narrowed. By turning me against my mother? Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no answer because there was no good answer. Not anymore. Rachel spoke up suddenly. Her voice was trembling. You told us she hid the money. Linda didn't respond. Rachel continued. You told us she manipulated people. Nothing. You told us she made Michael's life miserable. The silence became unbearable. I watched Rachel's face change. Realization, remorse, shame. For years, she had believed parts of these stories. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to influence the way she saw me, enough to influence her marriage, enough to influence our family. Then Emily stood up. No hesitation, no fear, only honesty, the kind of honesty adults so often lose. I always felt something was wrong. Everyone looked at her. Emily wiped tears from her cheeks. You never talked about Grandma the way you talked about everyone else. She looked straight at Linda. Every time Grandpa was mentioned, you got weird. Linda looked stunned. Emily continued, every time Grandma said something nice about Grandpa, you got angry. No one interrupted. Because she was right. Children notice everything, far beyond the awareness of adults. Emily looked at her father. Dad, Grandma never said anything bad about anyone. The statement hit Ethan hard. I could tell, because even now, after everything, it was true. I had never tried to destroy Linda, never tried to expose Michael, never tried to defend myself by attacking others. Maybe I should have, but I hadn't. And now everyone realized it. The room remained quiet for a long while. Then, Ethan slowly walked around the table. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure what he intended to do, neither was anyone else. When he reached me, he stopped, just standing there looking down at me. His eyes were filled with tears. The eyes I had watched grow from childhood to adulthood. The eyes that had once trusted me completely. The eyes that had recently looked at me with nothing but judgment. Now they were filled with something else, remorse, pure remorse. Then Ethan did something that shocked everyone. He knelt right there beside my chair. Rachel gasped. Emily covered her mouth. Even Robert looked shocked. I certainly was too. My son looked up at me. Tears streamed down his face. When he spoke, his voice was completely shattered. I'm sorry. The words broke something inside me. Not because they erased the pain, but because they were true, completely true. I am so sorry. I closed my eyes. Tears flowed uncontrollably. For years, I had imagined hearing these words. Now that they had finally come, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt heartbreaking. Because apologies couldn't buy back the years lost, couldn't erase the wounds, couldn't undo the damage. They only acknowledged the hurt, and sometimes that's just as painful. Ethan continued, I thought I knew everything. His voice was trembling. I thought I understood what happened. More tears. I judged you. Pause. I shamed you. Pause. I believed the lies. The room was deathly quiet. No one looked away. No one interrupted. Everyone needed to hear this, including him. Then he said the words that hurt the most. That day at the birthday party. His face contorted. God! He bowed his head. The things I said. I remembered those words immediately. Every word, every accusation, every look from the family, every second of humiliation. The memory still stung. From the look on Ethan's face, he knew it. I can't take them back. His voice was barely audible. No, I spoke for the first time. The simple word felt so heavy. Ethan nodded. More tears fell. I know. Then he looked up again, his face filled with desperation like a child, broken apart. Can you forgive me? The question hung in the room. Everyone was waiting. Rachel, Emily, Robert, even Linda. They all watched me, waiting for an answer. But forgiveness isn't a switch. It doesn't activate just because someone apologizes. Especially not after 12 years. Especially not after repeated betrayals. Especially not after public humiliation. I looked at my son, the man I loved, the man who had hurt me, the man who finally saw the truth. I realized something important. I wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready to answer Ethan's question. Not because I wanted to punish him, not because I wanted revenge, but because forgiveness and healing are not the same thing. And healing takes time. But not angry all the time, I added. His expression turned curious. Why? I smiled. Because people are multifaceted. He listened quietly. Your father hurt me, I said, not sugarcoating the truth. He lied. A pause. He made terrible choices. Another pause. He created problems that affected all of us. Ethan nodded. Then I continued, but he also loved us. The words hung in the air. He wasn't a monster. I looked out at the water. He was a deeply flawed man who spent years making mistakes. I gave a gentle smile. And in the end, he knew it himself. For a long time, Ethan didn't say anything. Then he nodded. I think that's the hardest part. What's the hardest part? Realizing that people aren't just black and white heroes or villains. I smiled. Now he got it. He really got it. It was one of the biggest lessons hidden in this whole story. Life isn't simple. People aren't simple. The truth is rarely simple. Eventually, our food arrived. Neither of us had much of an appetite. Still, we ate. Then, we talked. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years. We talked about childhood memories, about Michael, about the family, about the mistakes, and about the healing. At one point, Ethan looked straight at me. I don't expect forgiveness. The words surprised me, but he continued, I hope for forgiveness. A pause. But I don't demand it. I studied his face. The humility felt genuine, not performed, not strategic. Genuine. Then, I realized something. For months, he had been showing me the same thing through his letters, his actions, and his patience. He hadn't demanded anything. He hadn't rushed me. He hadn't made excuses. He just persistently showed up over and over again. Perhaps that was more important than any apology, because change isn't measured in words, it's measured in actions. Lunch lasted nearly 3 hours. When we finally stood up to leave, neither of us seemed eager for it to end. It felt like progress, real progress. Before we headed to our cars, Ethan stopped. There in the parking lot by the river, under the clear autumn sky, he looked at me. Mom. Yeah? I love you. The words hit me harder than I expected. For years, they had been buried under layers of misunderstanding. Now they stood on their own, clear, honest, simple. I smiled. I love you too. For the first time in a very, very long time, the words felt complete. No scars, no hesitation, just complete. A few weeks later, Thanksgiving arrived. The irony wasn't lost on me. Family gatherings had been the backdrop for some of the most painful moments of my life. This time it felt different. Not perfect. Just different. When I arrived at Ethan and Rachel's house, Emily practically tackled me with a hug. Rachel welcomed me warmly. Robert was already there. Even Linda attended, though a cautious, understandable distance remained between us. Healing can't erase consequences, but it does create opportunities. Dinner felt quieter than in years past. More thoughtful, more sincere. Nobody was pretending. Nobody was performing. Nobody was maintaining the fantasy. Somehow that made everything feel more real. At one point during dinner, Emily stood up and raised her glass. Everyone looked at her. She smiled. I just wanted to say something. Rachel laughed. Oh boy. Emily ignored her. I think this is the first family dinner where everyone is actually telling the truth. A startled ripple of laughter erupted around the table. Even I laughed. Because she wasn't wrong. Not entirely. Then Emily looked straight at me. I'm really glad you could come, Grandma. My heart felt full. I'm really glad too. The rest of the evening passed peacefully. No drama, imperfect, but peaceful. And honestly, that was enough. After I got home that night, I sat alone on the back porch. The same porch where I had cried years ago. The same porch where I had questioned everything. The same porch where I had believed my family might never recover. The night air was cool. The stars were visible. For the first time in 12 years, I felt true peace. Not because everyone had apologized, not because every relationship was fixed, not because the past had disappeared. The past never disappears. I felt peace because the truth was finally free. For years I had believed that speaking the truth would destroy my family. I was wrong. It was the lies that almost destroyed us. And it was the truth that saved us. Not immediately, not without pain, but ultimately, it saved us. Because the truth gave people the chance to choose, to understand, to grow, and to heal. As I reflected on everything under the stars, I realized the greatest lesson of all. The most dangerous burden wasn't the truth, it was carrying a lie for so long that everyone had forgotten what reality looked like. That burden nearly crushed me, but now it never would again. My name is Gwen Sullivan. After 12 years of silence, I finally told everyone the truth. It cost me more than words can describe. But in the end, it gave me back something even more precious. My home. Sometimes the people who love us the most can hurt us the deepest. Not because they are evil, not because they don't care, but because they believe things that never truly happened. One of the most painful lessons I learned is that silence has a price. We often keep silent to protect others. We hide our pain to keep the peace. We carry burdens alone because we believe we're doing the right thing. But when silence allows lies to grow, it's no longer protection, it becomes a prison. For years, I thought I was protecting my husband's memory. I thought I was protecting my son from pain. What I didn't realize was that every secret left room for others to invent stories. Eventually, they did. Another lesson is that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Forgiveness is a process. Building trust is a process. Healing is a process. Nothing happens overnight. People who are truly sorry for their actions don't just apologize. They change. They take responsibility. They remain patient while trust is being rebuilt. That is true growth. Most importantly, remember this. The truth might hurt. The truth might be uncomfortable. The truth might even break your heart. But the truth also creates the possibility of healing. Lies can only create a temporary peace. Only the truth can create a lasting one. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been misunderstood by someone you loved? Have you ever carried a secret to protect others? Do you think Gwen's choice to stay silent for so long was the right one? Please share your experiences in the comments. Your story might make someone else feel a little less alone. If stories about family resilience, healing, and emotional justice mean something to you, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys like this. Thank you for spending your time with me.